It was a moment that needed no introduction, no build-up, no grandstanding. One sentence, delivered without hesitation, dropped into the chamber like a lightning strike, and suddenly everything stopped. Conversations halted, eyes widened, and for a split second, the nation seemed to lean in closer to its screens. Jasmine Crockett had spoken, and Nancy Mace's carefully rehearsed smirk faded into something unrecognizable. Shock. The words themselves were deceptively simple, but the impact was seismic. They cut through the haze of political theatre, slicing past the bluster and the smug interruptions, and landed with a weight no one in the room could ignore. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it wasn't just a soundbite. It was the kind of line that lives beyond the walls of Congress, etched instantly into the culture, destined to replay on loop across millions of phones, feeds, and television screens. Nancy. Mace had walked into the room that day dressed in the armor of arrogance. She carried herself with the sharpness of someone convinced she had already won the exchange before it began. The condescending glances, the smug interruptions, the mocking tone, every gesture dripped with the air of superiority. To her, Crockett was supposed to be an easy target, someone to belittle, someone to frame as emotional, inexperienced, out of her depth. Mace believed she had the upper hand, and she played it with the kind of confidence that only comes from underestimating your opponent. But then, in a single breath, Jasmine Crockett reversed the entire equation. With a calm, measured voice, she fired off a one-liner so sharp it cracked the polished veneer of her opponent. Suddenly, the room wasn't Mace's stage anymore. It was Crockett's. And as silence filled the chamber, America could almost hear the sound of a political mask shattering. This wasn't supposed to happen, not to Nancy Mace, not in a room where she thought she controlled the spotlight. Yet here she was, staring into the wreckage of her own arrogance, left speechless by a line so devastating it required no follow-up. But to understand how this single sentence shattered Nancy Mace's confidence, we need to go back. The setting was no ordinary committee hearing. On the surface, it looked like the usual Washington ritual. Suited staffers shuffling papers, the low hum of side conversations, the stiff formality of a chamber designed to project order. But beneath that polished surface, tension crackled like static before a storm. Cameras were everywhere, C-SPAN broadcasting live, reporters ready to clip 30-second soundbites for the evening news, political operatives waiting to weaponize any stumble. It wasn't just a hearing, it was a stage, and every word was destined to travel far beyond those walls. In today's America, that stage carries extraordinary weight. Politics has become less about policy and more about performance. A single exchange can inflame a nation, spark hashtags, or launch careers into orbit. That's why moments like these matter more than ever. They serve as cultural Rorschach tests, snapshots of who we are and what values we choose to elevate. For a country splintered along lines of identity, race, and ideology, one sharp clash can feel like a proxy war for everything simmering beneath the surface. Nancy Mace knew this, and she relished it. She didn't come to ask questions or listen in good faith. She came to perform. From the moment she leaned forward in her chair, the glint in her eyes carried a message. Watch me dominate this exchange. Her words weren't meant for the witnesses or the colleagues across the aisle. They were rehearsed for the cameras, polished for the viral clip she believed she'd walk away with. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, who carried herself in stark contrast. Crockett wasn't playing to the cameras. though they were watching her just the same. She didn't need to force theatrics or rehearse her cadence. Calm, sharp, and grounded, she exuded the confidence of someone who has stood in tougher rooms, faced tougher fights, and won by relying on substance, not spectacle. To many in Washington, she was still underestimated, dismissed as too new, too unpolished, too unwilling to play by the unspoken rules of political theatre. And that underestimation was Mace's first mistake, because what unfolded wasn't just a debate over facts. It was something deeper, something more visceral. When Mace launched her barbs, dripping with smug self-assurance, she wasn't simply questioning Crockett. She was questioning her right to belong in that space. She was wielding the same old tactics of dismissal and diminishment that women of color in power have faced for generations. And in that moment, it became clear. This wasn't just a clash of personalities. This was dignity on trial. The air grew heavier with each exchange. You could almost feel the audience, both in the room and across the country, holding its breath. Whose story would prevail? The polished performance of a congresswoman desperate for viral dominance, or the steady truth of someone unwilling to bow to condescension? Every smirk from Mace, every interruption, every condescending glance made the stakes higher. If Crockett faltered, it would be replayed endlessly as proof that arrogance wins. But if she stood her ground, the underdog could flip the entire narrative, and Nancy Mace had no idea the trap she was walking into. Nancy Mace has always presented herself as the politician who can't be boxed in. She likes to play the part of the reasonable conservative, the one who claims independence from party lines, the one who says she's just here to speak for common sense. It's an image carefully polished for headlines and sound bites, an image of balance, moderation, even pragmatism. But scratch beneath the surface, and a different story emerges. A story of a politician who thrives on grandstanding, who feeds on the spectacle of confrontation, and who consistently underestimates the very people she seeks to put down. This contradiction is at the heart of her persona. On one hand, Mace markets herself as a bridge builder. On the other, she eagerly reaches for the camera every chance she gets, never hesitating to throw out lines designed not to solve problems, but to score points. It's the irony of her brand. She insists she's above the theatre of politics, even as she auditions for the starring role in every act. You can see this pattern in the way she moves through hearings. She leans forward with a calculated poise, making eye contact not with the witnesses, but with the cameras. She repeats talking points that have little to do with the matter at hand, but everything to do with building her personal brand. For Mace, each exchange is a performance, and like any performer too invested in their own spotlight, she often mistakes arrogance for authority. There have been moments before where this arrogance betrayed her. She has mocked opponents only to watch them flip her words back on her. She has postured as the voice of reason while delivering statements that contradict her own voting record. Time and again, she has assumed her target would stay silent, too timid to fight back, and time and again, she's been caught off guard when the pushback comes stronger than expected. Still, she doesn't change course. Each time, she doubles down, convinced that her wit and condescension will win the day, and that's the core of her miscalculation. Nancy Mace underestimates people. She underestimates their memory, assuming they won't notice the inconsistencies between her words and her record. She underestimates her opponents, assuming they'll crumble under her smirk and her snide remarks. And she underestimates the American public, assuming they'll mistake her swagger for strength. That day in the hearing room, she carried herself with the same misplaced confidence. She believed she had already scripted the outcome. Jasmine Crockett would falter, appear emotional, and Mace would emerge with the clip that solidified her dominance. She played her role with rehearsed precision, layering condescension over her words, smirking at her own interruptions, certain that she had cornered her opponent. But in her certainty, she revealed her greatest weakness. For all her claims of being reasonable, her tone betrayed her disdain. For all her posturing about listening, her interruptions betrayed her dismissal. For all her attempts to project authority, her arrogance betrayed her insecurity. The image of balance and moderation cracked under the weight of her performance, and in that crack, her vulnerability was exposed. Because what Nancy Mace failed to realize was that her opponent was not intimidated. Jasmine Crockett was not another prop for her political theatre. She was not there to play along with the script Mace had written in her head, and unlike the others Mace had underestimated before, Crockett carried a presence sharpened by years of real struggle, years of fighting in rooms far less forgiving than this one. That single truth, Crockett's refusal to bend to the performance, was about to turn Mace's act into her undoing. The stage she thought belonged to her was about to be stolen in one devastating sentence. But across the table sat a congresswoman forged in struggle, and she was about to strike back. Before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in Congress, she had already learned how to fight battles most politicians only pretend to understand. Her journey didn't begin with wealthy donors or Ivy League grooming. It began in courtrooms where the stakes were not abstract policies, but the lives and freedoms of ordinary people, often those with the least resources and the most stacked against them. As an attorney, Crockett cut her teeth defending the voiceless, the overlooked, the ones society too often discards. She represented those who couldn't afford high-priced counsel, those targeted by a system that seemed designed to break them. Each case was more than just a client file. It was a reminder that justice in America is not automatic. It has to be fought for. It was in those courtrooms that Crockett forged the demeanor Washington elites now misread as too raw or too blunt. They see her refusal to play by their polished script as inexperience. In reality, it is experience of a different kind, one born of living closer to the ground, closer to the communities that power ignores. For her, authenticity isn't a strategy, it's survival. When you've had to look people in the eye and tell them the system might crush them unless someone fights back, you don't have time for rehearsed lines or empty performances. You learn to cut through the noise with the truth. This plain-spoken, truth-telling became Crockett's signature. She doesn't hide behind euphemisms. She doesn't twist herself into knots to appease the powerful. She speaks the way her community speaks, direct, unvarnished, real. And that's precisely what unsettles Washington insiders. They are used to colleagues who posture, who cloak their ambitions in lofty language, who stick to the well-rehearsed script of politics as theatre. But Crockett refuses the mask. Her truth is her weapon, and she wields it without apology. That refusal to conform has made her a target, Elites whisper that she lacks polish, that she's too much, that she doesn't understand how the game is played. But they forget. She's not here to play their game. She's here to change the rules. And for every whisper in a Capitol hallway, there are thousands of people back home who see her as exactly what they need. Someone unafraid, to speak in the voice of the people who sent her. Her path to Congress wasn't smoothed by establishment blessing. It was earned, brick by brick, in the rough and tumble grind of local organizing and grassroots campaigning. She knew what it meant to knock doors, to listen to everyday struggles, to carry those stories into the halls of power. And every step of the way, she was underestimated. Opponents assumed she wouldn't have the fundraising to compete, that she'd burn out under pressure, that voters wouldn't take a chance on her. Time and again, she proved them wrong, not by trying to match their polish, but by amplifying her authenticity. This history is why the confrontation with Nancy Mace carried a weight beyond a single exchange. Crockett walked into that hearing room carrying the strength of those courtroom battles, the grit of grassroots campaigns, and the scars of being doubted and dismissed. She knew what it meant to be underestimated. She had lived it her whole career, and she knew that sometimes the most devastating answer isn't a long-winded speech or a stack of documents. It's a single, undeniable truth delivered at exactly the right moment. In her posture, in her calm presence, in the steadiness of her gaze, Crockett carried that history into the chamber. She didn't need to puff up her chest or perform outrage. She didn't need to shout to be heard. Her power came from a deeper place, a place Nancy Mace could neither understand nor mimic. Mace played to the cameras. Crockett played to something higher. Dignity, resilience, and the voices of those who had been told their truth didn't matter. And this is why, when the clash began, Crockett's silence in the face of Mace's smug interruptions wasn't weakness. It was strategy. She let Mace talk herself into a corner, let her arrogance swell unchecked, because Crockett knew what Mace did not. The most underestimated opponent is often the most dangerous. Jasmine Crockett wasn't in that room to play along with Nancy Mace's performance. She was there to show the country that authenticity doesn't need polish, and truth doesn't need permission. Her journey had prepared her for exactly this kind of moment, a showdown where arrogance meets dignity and dignity wins. And when Mace tried to belittle her, Crockett reached for a single sentence that would change everything. The clash began not with fireworks, but with Nancy Mace's trademark smirk. She leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk, eyes narrowing as if she were the sole arbiter of truth in the room. Her voice carried that unmistakable tone, half condescending, half theatrical, meant to signal authority while broadcasting disdain. She spoke over others, dismissing context, reducing serious points into punchlines designed for the cameras. Each interruption was delivered with a sharpened edge, as though she believed she could grind down her opponent simply by refusing to let her finish a sentence. Crockett sat across from her, hands folded, expression steady. To those unfamiliar with her, the restraint may have looked like hesitation. But to anyone who had seen Crockett in action before, it was something else entirely. Patience. She let Mace take the floor, let her words pile higher and higher like a tower of arrogance waiting to topple. The audience could feel it too. There was a shift in the room, a rising tension, the sense that something was building beneath the Surface. Mace jabbed again, this time with mock pity in her tone. She chuckled under her breath, dismissing Crockett's points before they were fully made, turning substance into spectacle. It was clear she wasn't debating in good faith. She was performing, every phrase crafted to create a viral moment where she appeared untouchable. Her gestures were exaggerated, her glances toward the cameras deliberate. To her, this wasn't about governance. It was about dominance. Yet the more Mace pushed, the more Crockett's composure stood out. She didn't flinch at the barbs. She didn't match insult with insult. Instead, she let silence hang after each interruption, her calm gaze locking onto Mace with a weight that words couldn't match. That silence spoke louder than any rebuttal in the moment. It told the room she wasn't rattled. She was waiting. You could almost see the realization dawning on observers. Crockett wasn't cornered. She was calculating. Each time Mace laughed, at her, Crockett's calm became more powerful. Each time Mace leaned on arrogance, Crockett's dignity became sharper. It was the classic contrast. The loud arrogance of someone desperate to control the stage against the quiet strength of someone who doesn't need the spotlight to command respect. The energy in the room shifted further. Staffers who had been shuffling papers now leaned slightly forward. Colleagues glanced between the two women, sensing something was about to snap. Even the cameras seemed to zoom in closer, as though they too understood that this wasn't just routine sparring. It was a duel escalating toward a breaking point. Mace couldn't see it. She mistook Crockett's patience for weakness. With every smug jab, she doubled down, layering her condescension, leaning harder into the arrogance that had defined her throughout the exchange. To Mace, she was in control. To everyone else, it was becoming clear she was walking blindfolded toward her undoing. And then came the moment, the pause. Crockett drew a breath, lifted her gaze, and let the silence stretch just long enough for the room to fall still. It was the kind of silence that announces itself, the kind that makes even the most confident performer realize they've misjudged. The script. Every eye turned to Crockett. Every voice went quiet. The anticipation became electric. And then, with one calm pause, Jasmine Crockett unleashed the line that would echo across America. It came like a blade, swift, precise, devastating. Jasmine Crockett had sat in silence as Nancy Mace paraded her arrogance, every smirk and interruption meant to humiliate. But when she finally spoke, her words didn't rise to match Mace's bluster. They cut under it. In one clean line, Crockett dismantled everything Mace had built for herself in that hearing. The rhythm of it was part of the power. Crockett didn't rush. She let each word fall heavy, deliberate, chosen like an attorney delivering the final sentence of a closing argument. It was the kind of cadence that made the audience lean in, made even the cameras seem to draw closer. She wasn't performing for viral attention, yet the very lack of performance made the moment irresistible. The line landed, one sentence, one strike. One collapse. The room froze. There was no clever rebuttal, no smug smile to recover with. For the first time in the exchange, Nancy Mace was silent. Her expression faltered, the confidence draining like colour from her face. The smirk she had worn so proudly only minutes earlier now looked strained, brittle, as if it might crack under the weight of the silence pressing down on her. Her eyes darted, searching for a way to retake the upper hand. but there was none. Crockett's words had locked her in place. It was the stillness that made it unforgettable. Silence in politics is rare, normally filled with interruptions, protests, or applause. But here, silence was the verdict. The pause after Crockett's one-liner was louder than any shouting match could have been. It was the silence of recognition, the silence of a room realizing it had just witnessed something irreversible. Murmurs started low, almost cautious, like people testing the air to see if it was safe to react. A few chuckles broke through, nervous at first, then freer. Gasps rippled across the chamber, the sound of witnesses who knew they'd be telling the story for years. I was there when it happened. Staffers who had been scribbling notes lifted, their heads. Reporters glanced at one another, already framing the headlines in their minds. This wasn't just another committee clip. This was a moment destined for replay, and replay it did. Even as the hearing continued, phones lit up. Aides in the back row clipped the line, texting it out to friends, allies, reporters. Within minutes, snippets were bouncing across group chats, racing toward the digital bloodstream of the nation. Twitter feeds started to light up. TikTok creators were already pairing the clip with captions, filters, and reaction faces. The viral wave had begun before Nancy Mace could even gather her composure. The irony was impossible to miss. Mace had entered the room hunting for a viral moment. She had rehearsed her smirks, sharpened her barbs, tailored her condescension for the cameras. But the line that would echo across America didn't belong to her. It belonged to Jasmine Crockett, the woman she had dismissed, underestimated, and tried to belittle. In a single instant, Crockett had stolen not only the spotlight, but the entire script. And it wasn't just the words themselves, it was the precision. Crockett knew exactly what she was doing. She waited until Mace had overextended, until the arrogance was undeniable, until the audience itself was restless for release. Then she struck with a line that was both devastatingly personal and universally resonant. That's why it worked. It wasn't just an attack on Mace, it was a defense of dignity itself. One sentence, one strike, one collapse. Nancy Mace's body language betrayed what her silence couldn't hide. She shifted in her seat, eyes down, hands fidgeting against the desk. The armor of arrogance she had worn so confidently at the start was gone, replaced by a visible discomfort she couldn't mask. Crockett hadn't raised her voice, hadn't leaned forward, hadn't played to the cameras, and yet she commanded the room. The catharsis was immediate. For everyone who had sat through Mace's smug performance, the line was the release they'd been waiting for. It was as if Crockett had spoken not just for herself, but for every viewer exhausted by the arrogance of politicians who perform instead of listening. The audience didn't just hear the words, they felt them. They carried the sting that arrogance deserves and the validation that dignity demands. Reactions rippled outward like aftershocks. Allies in the room couldn't suppress their smiles. Opponents shifted uncomfortably, knowing the clip would be impossible to spin. And somewhere deep in the halls of power, strategists were already groaning at the realization. Nancy Mace had just lost the narrative. The moment became more than a committee exchange. It became a parable. In an age where politics often feels like noise, a single sentence had cut through with devastating clarity. It proved that arrogance, no matter how loud, can be undone by authenticity, spoken with precision. It reminded the country that truth doesn't need theatrics. Sometimes truth only needs one voice, steady, unafraid, and perfectly timed. One sentence, one strike, one collapse. But the shockwaves weren't confined to the room. America was about to erupt. The clip spread like wildfire. Before the hearing had even adjourned, it was already coursing through the veins of social media. On Twitter, now rebranded as X, the hashtags lit up in seconds. Crockett clapback. One-line KO. Mace face. Users who had never tuned into a congressional hearing in their lives were suddenly sharing the clip, retweeting it with captions like, "This is how you handle arrogance," and one sentence did more than hours of debate. The line wasn't just political commentary anymore. It was entertainment, validation, and empowerment all rolled into one. Over on TikTok, the remix culture exploded. Creators layered Crockett's line over dramatic soundtracks, zooming in on Mace's stunned expression for comedic effect. Others slowed down the clip, captioning it like a boxing replay. "Here's where the knockout lands." Memes sprouted. Overnight, Crockett's calm face juxtaposed with Mace's unraveling smirk, GIFs looping the exact moment of silence after the mic drop, captions reading simply, "And that's the tweet." What made the wave unstoppable wasn't just the humor, it was the catharsis. People across the country saw in Crockett's one-liner something bigger than politics. It was the satisfaction of watching arrogance punctured by authenticity. For women, for people of color, for anyone who had ever been talked over or belittled, the clip resonated as a universal experience. That moment when dignity refuses to bow. The mainstream media couldn't ignore it either. Within hours, headlines appeared across the spectrum. Progressive outlets praised Crockett for her composure, calling it the most memorable congressional exchange of the year. Even skeptical networks admitted the line had landed with devastating force. Pundits filled the airwaves with analysis. Some marveled at Crockett's rhetorical precision. Others tried awkwardly to defend Mace, but the footage spoke louder than any spin. The silence after the line was impossible to talk away. Late-night comedians joined in, weaving the clip into their monologues. One joked that the silence following Crockett's words was the loudest sound on Capitol Hill in years. Another quipped that Nancy Mace had experienced the political version of the blue screen of death. Each retelling only cemented the moment's cultural status, but perhaps the most powerful reaction came from everyday Americans. Comment sections filled with stories. People recalling times they'd been dismissed at work, talked over in class, belittled in meetings. Crockett's one-liner became a vessel for those emotions. It wasn't just her victory, it was theirs. Strangers wrote things like, "She said what I've always wanted to say," or "This gave me the courage to stand taller today." The validation layer transformed a political takedown into a cultural rallying cry. The ripple effects were immediate. Jasmine Crockett, who had been known mainly in political circles, became a household name overnight. Her follower counts surged, her speeches replayed, her profile elevated as a symbol of fearless truth-telling. In contrast, Nancy Mace became a punchline. The smirk she had worn like armor was now immortalized as a meme, the before and after face of arrogance undone. This transformation wasn't just a victory for Crockett. It was a cultural shift. At a time when politics often feels hopelessly stuck in gridlock, here was proof that authenticity could still break through. It reminded Americans that even in the noise, there are moments that cut across divisions, moments that speak directly to dignity and truth. The hearing had ended, but the story had only just begun. The line lived on, carried not by official transcripts, but by the voices of millions replaying, resharing, and reframing it. It became shorthand for something bigger than a clash between two politicians. It became a mirror, reflecting what people wanted to see in their leaders and what they refused to tolerate any longer. But this wasn't just about Crockett versus Mace. It was about what it revealed about us. In the days that followed, the replay of Jasmine Crockett's one-liner shifted from a viral clip to something deeper. Commentators began calling it a moment of clarity, a rare instant in American politics where the noise fell away and a single truth cut through. For many, it was about more than a congressional hearing. It was about the kind of country we want to be, and the values we choose to elevate when the spotlight turns harsh. Because what we witnessed wasn't just an exchange of words. It was dignity confronting arrogance. It was authenticity breaking through the carefully staged theatre of politics. Nancy Mace came armed with smirks, posturing, and rehearsed lines meant for cameras. But Crockett didn't need any of that. She needed only her truth, delivered plainly, without theatrics, and all the more devastating for it. In that contrast, America saw something timeless. That performance may win applause for a moment, but authenticity endures. It is a dynamic as old as democracy itself. Arrogance thrives when it assumes no one will push back. Pretension grows when it believes substance doesn't matter, but dignity, quiet, patient, unwavering, always waits for its chance. Crockett's sentence reminded us that dignity doesn't have to shout. It doesn't have to interrupt or posture. It simply has to stand firm. And when it does, arrogance collapses under its own weight. That is why the moment resonated so powerfully with everyday Americans, because the struggle between dignity and arrogance isn't confined to Capitol Hill. It happens in classrooms, in workplaces, in families, in boardrooms. We've all seen someone try to dominate with condescension. Framed this way, the clash between Crockett and Mace wasn't simply political drama. It was a moral parable, an underdog's triumph that carried the weight of American identity. This nation has always celebrated those who rise from struggle, those who confront arrogance with honesty, those who remind the powerful that their strength lies not in titles or theatrics, but in truth. Crockett's victory wasn't handed to her. It was earned through resilience, preparation, and the quiet confidence of someone who knows who she is. And that, perhaps, is why the moment became so widely shared. It wasn't just about two women in a room full of lawmakers. It was about America itself, caught between competing visions, one of arrogance and hollow performance, the other of authenticity and dignity. One tries to dominate the stage with spectacle. The other reminds us that the stage belongs to the people, and the people know the difference between noise and truth. As the clip continued to echo, it left Americans reflecting on their own choices. Whose example do we want to follow? The one who smirks and postures, or the one who speaks plainly, grounded in truth? Do we measure leadership by how loud someone can be, or by how deeply their words resonate when everything else falls silent? Crockett's one-liner didn't just humble a rival, it revealed something about us, our hunger for leaders who reflect resilience